But before that, I have one of the most important thinkers of our time, Peter Joseph. He created the viral Zeitgeist movies, which then spawned the Zeitgeist Movement, which has hundreds of chapters and thousands of members around the world. He also wrote and created a series called Culture in Decline. And now he has a new and, in my opinion, incredibly important book out called The New Human Rights Movement. Here's my conversation with my friend Peter Joseph. Peter, thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure, Lee. Always a pleasure.
So, I'm just going to jump straight in. We're going to get some of the basic structural stuff out of the way. When we grow up, as we're growing up, we're sold a religion. And this religion is bigger than Christianity. It's bigger than Judaism. It's the market economy. Yeah. And we're sold it every day of our lives. And we're told it's good and it makes everything right. And it will solve the world's problems. And you just got to believe in it. What's wrong with that?
The faith in the invisible hand of the market, which eventually, like all religions, evolved into the orthodox, intolerant view of neoliberalism. So, you know, it's very convenient to think that there's some internal dynamic in our economy that's self-regulating, that's the term, that there's an equilibrium to be found. And what isn't talked about, which I point out in this book, is for about 70 years, true economic theorists, microeconomic theorists have sat there trying to formulate their equations, utilitarian equations, beliefs about human behavior to figure out how equilibrium is generated, because that's what the invisible hand implies. That's what the stability is supposed to be.
And when we get to equilibrium, it'll be stable.
Yeah, there's an assumption, and it's been prevailing, it's a mythology, and guess what? It doesn't exist. And they're the first to admit it. There's whole books that have been written now, there is no equilibrium. The only equilibrium that could be created involve variables that literally all these pure economists think are irrational and have no place to begin with. So that's one of the groundbreaking things no one talks about. So it's not just we can speculate and we can do this type of analysis as done, say, in the book or by other theorists that are working against market economics. It's been well established that there's no equilibrium. We have complete imbalance. We have poverty. We have all the externalities. We have a general move towards disequilibrium through the entire system, which is where the state comes in. Of course, you talk to a libertarian, oh, the state's now the enemy. They don't realize the dynamic, the synergy between the two historically, and a whole bunch of things that I could spiral out of control and ramble and start yelling eventually.
That's all right. Your rambling's enjoyable. But and you can see the systems collapsing kind of around our planet, whether it's the acidifying of the oceans or the
Well, let's just start with the close to 1 billion people in poverty that don't get their basic nutrition. To me, that's a collapse right there. The system never formed itself. It's always been in a state of collapse. There's the ins and the outs. If you're on the outs, you're just ignored effectively by the theories of this system, which that's a negative externality. That's an important term that people need to understand. Negative externality are things that the market doesn't recognize or can't navigate or control. So, for example, poverty, what do we have? We have charity. That's the only form of wealth redistribution that society accepts. You can leave it up to the billionaire class to decide how they're going to take care of all this exhaust, effectively, that has come out of this system to try and correct it. Same goes for the fact massive global pollution, every life support system in decline. Recent stat I just read, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050. So how do you deal with that? You create all these NGOs and all these people that are trying to do something outside of the market system, even though they have to be slightly within it. I mean, that's really what all of the NGOs and the NPOs and grassroots organizations, the thousands and thousands of them that keep multiplying, they are there to clean up the disaster wake that's left from the market.
It's the Band-Aids on the open wounds.
And it's astounding to me that people don't really put that together to realize that that's where the activist community needs to focus. And that's why the book is focused in the direction that it is.
And these externalities aren't even, they're not even really calculated in most of these equations.
Oh, no.
So, you see that a hamburger at McDonald's still costs $1 to this day. It's like 96 cents or something. Meanwhile, if it calculated for all those externalities, the pollution, everything else, the oil, the water used to raise a cow, it'd be $200 for a hamburger.
Sure. More the fact that they analyzed all the major corporations. Meaning there was a study done about 2 years ago, finding that if you took the negative externalities into account, there's no profitability in any of these major, which effectively means there's no profitability across the whole of capitalism. Right. If you factor in real-life concerns.
All right, so I know we're moving fast here, but one of the keys to the market economy is debt. And you say in your book, it is estimated that by 2060, 60% of all countries in the world will be bankrupt, while the U.S. alone will have a debt of 415% of GDP by 2050. Now, on a certain level, debt is customary fiction and can be erased with the flick of a pen. So I guess people might be left feeling like, which is it? Is debt this incredibly powerful thing, and people are dying and suffering, and societies are crumbling under the load of this debt, or is it just a fiction?
It's both at the same time, and amongst many paradoxes in the system, and it's basically based on class hierarchy. The higher up you are, the more immune you are. Just like the wealthy get bailed out, the rich countries get bailed out. It doesn't matter if the United States is $19 trillion worth of debt or $190 trillion worth of debt, if it remains the peak of the global empire, stratified countries. That's because there's so many underlying geopolitical stratums and backdoor deals that understand that this debt is fiction, understand that there's more interest in debt in existence than money. There's $200 trillion of debt, only $80 trillion in global currency. Right. What does that result into? It means that the lower class just gets screwed over and over again. You have the boom and bust cycle. There's always the boom, everyone's all happy, capitalism works, and the bust happens. Oh, everyone suffers, right? No. The lower classes get destroyed by this.
Like Greece, for example.
Well, yeah, you could work on an international level or a domestic level, the same type of dynamics. And so when the bust happens, you have all of these, the large corporations can absorb smaller corporations. They have the capacity to withhold. And then to make a long story short, when the boom starts happening, when they start lowering interest rates, when they do QE, all that money effectively goes straight into the financial and corporate sectors, high-level corporate sectors anyway. And that's just statistic proven. That's also in the book. So in other words, it's a vehicle of class war. So debt has multiple levels, point being. Is it a fiction? Yeah. And we should recognize it as such. People should be clamoring to remove debt, student debt loan, government debt. Countries should not be held in austerity. There should be mass riots. But within the structure of capitalism, they have to make the math look like it works. If the math doesn't work in capitalism, well, maybe people might question it. So, and what is interest as well? I want to point this out because I talk to a lot of people that look into currency reform. They want to use complementary currencies. They want to move to blockchain and Bitcoin. But they miss the fact that when you're in the banking system and it's based in capitalism, based in the capitalist structure, you have to do something to create fees. Interest is the fee. Interest is the profit margin. Interest is the surplus value, so to speak. So that's why the system is what it is. So it's inherent to the structure. Does that make sense? Yeah, so you can't just have capitalism and somehow have a different kind of currency. If you want to do that, you have to nationalize the entire U.S. banking system so there's no profit involved. And since this is the hub of the 1%, the wealthy 5% of this planet that own so much now, 40% since the 1970s, we went from about 3% working in the financial services sector to about 5%. And the financial services sector was about 5% of GDP, and now it's about 30%. So that 30% of GDP is going to 5% of the population. That's how powerful the small financial services, Wall Street conglomerate is. So back to my point, you want to nationalize the banks, well, you're going up against the strongest political force in history.
And a lot of these people, hedge fund managers and the such, don't actually do anything. They don't create anything of substance. It's just moving of numbers around a screen. Yep. And it makes them incredibly wealthy.
It is the evolution in economically mature nations like the United States. That evolution is consistent. You see this happening with all countries. You go from merchant capitalism to financial capitalism. We outsource all our production. We are increasing dramatic efficiency, meaning that there's so much that we need to sell that we can't. So we subsidize that, so to speak, with all the financialization. Subsidize is the wrong word. We compensate for it through financialization. And that's why financialization has become so large and accepted, because it's really a driving force of the entire global economy now, even though it does nothing, even though it creates nothing and causes more imbalance. In fact, many theorists have argued that it's actually worse for Main Street, that the Wall Street even exists. It doesn't help Main Street at all. That's well accepted.
Well, hold on. Wall Street and capitalism, and I saw in another interview you brought this up as something you find frustrating where people keep saying it to you, so that's why I'm doing it. Okay. But Wall Street and capitalism is how you got your cell phone and your computer, and it gave you all these wonderful things, Peter.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. All that capitalism is an incentive system and a distribution architecture. So what happens inside of that is left to the will of the individual's gaming. So yeah, you can get efficiency. With the rise of technology since the Industrial Revolution, exceptional levels of efficiency has been created through design, through intelligent ingenuity, not through just the incentive structure of wanting profit.
So basically, technology came along with capitalism, and everybody points to capitalism as the thing that got them all those, good health devices and all that stuff. But
I'll put it this way: during the Second World War, there was this emerging hatred of communism. Obviously, the U.S. capitalist hegemony did not want to have anything to interfere with it, which of course bled into the Cold War for a long time and still basically exists in its weird echoes, as you know. And what they did, and the social planners, so to speak, government and big business got together and they tried to convince everyone after World War II, and keep in mind, the United States just terrorized the entire world with the atomic bomb. And that set a whole new precedent in terms of its newfound place as empire.
Right.
It also had the infrastructure and this new industrialization that happened while Europe was in ruins. So it started to produce like mad. And it convinced the public that buying and consuming and working was going to create an egalitarian system that paralleled the claims of communism. This is something that many people know about. So it would bullshit the people to think that the more they consume, they're helping the society, they're fighting communism, and they're creating more of an egalitarian structure because the more they consume, the more they create jobs and the cyclical consumption. Of course, it doesn't quite work out that way, does it?
Right,
and it's funny how this historian...
And now what percentage of America is under some form of debt? And,
less than 62% have less than $1,000 in savings.
Oh, yeah, and it was something like 50% can't get past a $500 emergency.
Yeah,
And so that's the bounty that we've been promised.
43% spend beyond their means every year because of the saturation of debt. It was the 1970s the credit expansion came forward because with the surplus goods that were being created, again, this very positive thing that happened since the Industrial Revolution, this increase in efficiency and the ability to move from factories produce, like thousands of percent increase in factory production. So what do? You have to get people money to buy this stuff to get more money fueled to the upper 1%. Right. So that was when credit expansion really, really hit. And that's actually something that we could talk about this, and I don't want to deviate too far, but people talk about universal basic income. I'm in favor of this because it can help poverty, but there's a certain caveat to it.
Basic income seems like it's getting a lot of people talking about it.
It is.
For once.
Now here, and even like Zuckerberg and these billionaires talking about it. Now why? Because it satisfies that need to give the population something so they can spend back into the system to keep supporting it and effectively, invariably, whether it's intentional or not, doesn't matter, it will just funnel right back up to the upper class anyway.
But it's something. So that's the problem of it. But you support it because it's a half step.
I support it because it would increase public health, and I don't want to see poverty.
Yeah.
I don't want to see this kind of suffering that we see across the world. So if the United States did do that, you'd see a massive increase in public health, but it would still preserve the system in a negative way. Okay,
I want to jump to the violence we see in our society with our military, but with a police militarization and really just one-on-one citizens, the rise of violent groups and things like that. Can that be connected back to the market economy? He says knowingly.
Any student of history will see that social inequality, by whatever perceived level, whether it's economic, whether it's racial, whether it's nationalistic, whether it's Aborigines versus settled, colonization, all of that has produced conflict. And what is the root of that? It's exploitation. It's the slavery, when I was in school, I was taught that slavery in America was, the whites just felt so superior and they would just enslave people because they looked different and had different beliefs. That's not at all what it was. We were using white indentured servants in the American colonies until it was discovered through the African slave trade, which existed prior, and which, by the way, these kings in Africa were selling the slaves outright. It had nothing to do with anything but money on both sides. So we realized it was a better investment to invest in slaves. Had no idea, didn't make any difference what they looked like. It was just easier that they looked different because you could catch them if they ran away. So there's more value to it as an investment. That's what it was. That's cost efficiency. That is the driving mechanism of capitalism. So not to deviate from your question regarding the violence, but why is it that we have all this interracial tension after 200 years? It's because we started with this foundation of exploiting an entire subclass, and the Black Panthers movement, the Martin Luther King, all of the tumultuous civil rights, the violence, the deaths. This is an echo of a basic kernel of the capitalist structure. And it's sad to me that most people don't see it that way. They think that somehow slavery was separate from the new free labor of today. Yeah, it's free labor in the abstraction of free labor when you're backed into a corner. So yeah, I'm sure the people that are making 15 cents an hour.
So you're saying there's not just something ingrained in us that makes us force another class down?
Well, I'll say this, when lower reptilian brain reactions, basic biological behaviorism. There are clearly reactions that we can see in our primate brethren that when in fear, when in threat, we stratify, we get dominant. We create these things based on whatever the circumstance requires. Usually it's just like physical brawn and so on. But we also have the prefrontal cortex. We have this new emerging thing, the amygdala, the hippocampus. We have consciousness, basically. And the question is, what are we pinging now? And I argue that the system we have now is just constantly pinging the lower reptilian brain, not allowing the fruits of our consciousness and empathy to actually come forward.
Right.
So it is a part of us.
And in fact, there's great examples of where the goal of, let's say, a store or shopping center is to get past that deeper thought. You know, and I think it's called the Gruen transfer, when you get into one of these shopping centers and slowly the lights and the sounds and the smells overwhelm you, and you get to a point where you finally are just like putting things in a bag without even thinking about what you're doing. You're just...
Oh, sure. Well, think about the ethic of shopping for fun. Think, where did this come from? I mean, people that I know, if you hear women, I've heard this in shows, like, oh, Saturdays are for shopping. There's such an abusive thing that's happened through advertising that has made people feel comfortable with the act of consuming, when it really should be the opposite. It should be an issue of social reflection when you engage in this system of economics, where you know that what you're doing does have repercussions across society. It's a basic sense of integration in society, as opposed to the douchebags driving on their car, the $250,000 cars, or the women with their $2,000 handbags, which are basically signatures of violence.
Melania Trump, $56,000 jacket.
I saw that.
It's hard
stunned. How detached from your reality can you be? At least in the Great Depression, all the Rockefellers, they wised up and they would drive around in little cars.
Right.
They wore old jackets. Now no one cares. Now it's just flagrant materialism, flagrant vanity.
I have part 2 of my interview with Peter Joseph, creator of the Zeitgeist Movement. He's out with a new book, and the last time we talked about the problems with our system. This time, he and I discussed the solutions. How do we fix this mess and start moving forward? Take a look. Well, the advertising gets to actually something else I wanted to ask you, which is, a while back for your other series, Culture in Decline, I did a thing on advertising and about how abusive they are to, you know, ads in general, to what they're trying to make us think and act. But I don't know what I don't think I explicitly said is that it's basically, the estimate is 1,000 to 3,000 ads and brand names a day, and they're all really selling one thing. It's need and solving that need with consuming, with consumerism. Is it possible to get past that system when we have that much advertising for this way of life? Like, there's just endless thousands and thousands of ads telling you this is the way it has to be.
Well, here's the way I look at advertising, the rise of consumerism, which, by the way, I don't know if people know that consumerism, I consider it a pejorative. But actually, this is an economic policy in the mid-20th century. Consumerism is a theory that people should behave this way to help each other. It's nuts. Completely, again, absent.
And after 9/11, Bush said, keep shopping, or they win.
So what I see it as is it's a structural transfer of the need to consume and to keep money moving, buying things over and over again to keep jobs, into the social psychology of people. That's what's happened. And again, there's a massive campaign, as I said earlier, in part that led people to this ethic of constant consumption as though it was a moral duty, an ethic. You're helping society by doing this. So you have to change the social system. That's what goes back to the book once again. If it's the new human rights movement, because if you want to change the way people think, if you want to change their general incentives, you have to change the structure that's organizing them. It's very fundamental. It's very simple, really.
So that, and you're saying that achieves
the only way we're gonna,
a new level of human rights.
Absolutely, well, achieves a new level of consciousness, new awareness. It forces that constant pinging of the lower fear reactions and that threat of survival. It enables people to finally break out and realize their humanity and our advancement and what we can do. We know human variability can exist in many different ways. There's nothing that says we have to live in this competitive, cutthroat world at all. Plenty of examples throughout history of pockets of people that have lived differently. Mm-hmm. And you see it, in fact, in the pockets within the structure. Say, in a corporation, of course, generally a corporation is fairly collaborative, while it may be highly competitive against other corporations. Same for the military. Very compatible. And then, of course, they're supporting an extremely violent war against some other group. So the groupistic thing is a problem, and that's been completely amplified by the current system.
Right.
Which brings us back to the new human rights movement, because at the root of all of this, we have this constant group antagonism. That's the flaw of the way we exist right now, and it's perpetuated by our economy.
Absolutely. I want to jump to some solutions because I think we've got people depressed enough. But you say that in the book, you say there are 5 shifts that need to happen in order to increase economic efficiency and to get to this new place, to these new human rights, really. And I just want to basically go through these. The first one you list is automation. And I actually, last week on Redacted, I did a piece on, I guess a study just came out of, or survey of AI experts, and they believe, like, most of them believe that AI will at least be capable of doing every job, and we're talking including creative jobs like best-selling novels and pop songs and stuff, be capable of it in 50 years and perhaps replace those jobs in 100 years. Yeah. Most of them believe that. Yeah. That's happening.
I think people go a little extreme, and I'm for all of this, by the way, but I think the interest in sort of creative dominance and then the fear of the sentient rise, and even Stephen Hawking has talked about the tremendous dangers of giving birth to AI and all the Matrix and Terminators movies all over again. But I think, I think there's a speculative side to it that is a little gratuitous as far as what we expect to happen, but I don't think we should go that far. I think we should just look at it from the standpoint of what can we do to free ourselves from labor. Mm-hmm. Remember, labor is at the root of the civil rights battle. Going all the way back to ancient slavery in Egypt, it's all about the abuse of labor, the lower labor class, the fighting of unions in early America. They've instantly deraded as communist, socialist, union busters, mafia,
sometimes
people getting killed. Yeah, absolutely. So that is at the root of it. And if we want, we can talk about the other elements too, but if we really want to get to the heart of stopping effectively the ongoing class war, the removal of labor for income would be the most profound thing that we could do, or at least subsided substantially.
What do you mean by removal?
Removal meaning that
replaced with automation.
Well, if it's replaced with automation, and then you start to subsidize, so to speak, you start to support people by lowering the hours, reducing the work day, reducing the work week, reducing the work hours, and then things like universal basic income. And there's other things I could rattle on that would compensate for the automation shift. But that's what needs to happen as one core step, which invariably has to happen to some degree.
And with the jobs disappearing, people are suffering when in fact that should be a good thing, where people have more time, they make the same amount of money, or whatever, if we're still in a money system. But it should be a good thing. The analogy that I try and use to explain to people is like, it's basically like we're all hamsters on treadmills, and they're slowly taking away the treadmills. And so the hamsters start beating the crap out of each other to try and get what's left. And then politicians come along and they say one of two things. They say either I'll bring back the treadmills and we go, yay! Or they say we'll make the treadmills go faster and we say, yay!
Exactly.
And no one says, why are we running on the treadmills?
Exactly. And then the identity is so locked into labor. People retire. It's statistically proven that they die sometimes after, quite frequently. 48,000 suicides are noted to have occurred between America and 63 European countries during the Great Recession, because not only deprivation, but they have no job. And there's that identity of having to work, especially men. They have this identity that's been ingrained in them that they're supposed to be the caretakers and all that stuff. So the cultural ramifications are very strong. We have to undo a lot of that.
But my argument against that is sometimes it's good when people die when they lose their job, like Roger Ailes. So
there's always an exception.
There's an exception. But I want to let's move to the next one. Access. Do we not have free access now? We're in a free country.
I love that. The freedom and democracy of it all, right?
Yeah.
Access is at the root of everything, whether we know it or not. Property is really just access because you don't really own anything. You don't take it with you. It's the labor, the ideas, what went into the construction of anything is a social phenomenon.
Right.
So it's an illusion that's been propagated in a very primitive view and born in the Malthusian period, which you had to hoard and you had to be protective. So property rights today dominate the majority of the legislation out there. If you look at almost all the crime legislation in the books relates to property, and most of the violence you see comes down to a property relationship as well.
And the police are largely defending property. And
well, exactly.
The perfect analogy is, or metaphor is Standing Rock, where you have cops protecting a pipeline against the people they've sworn to protect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that brings another subject of the role of the police and their structural position, but I don't want to go on that tangent. So access is at the core of it. We've slowly started to see the interest in access from sharing cars, from Airbnbs, from sharing homes, to people that have gone a little bit farther. They have tool sharing libraries, or even just the functional idea of the ancient library itself and the implications of that. So if you have an access society where you're not using property, or you've deviated away from it as much as you can, where you allow for people to gain access to things through a system that's not based on exchange, but we've generated.
This actually gets into the next one, open source.
Yeah, we can overflow with we can overlay that a little bit as well. So open source brings in the subject that effectively you have more efficiency generated through more minds focusing on something than just a boardroom. And that goes back to what I just said about the evolution, the social relationship to everything that we've created. You know, what goes into a computer is hundreds of years of investigation by countless people. I mean, honestly, thousands of years when you think about the evolution of science. So on that historical level, that exists in the sense of collaboration. And then on the parallel level, if you, as has been proven by people that develop Linux, by all these other math projects, all these things I list in the book as well, creating a collaborative commons where people have access and organized capacity to design and innovate can now be extended to anything. Cars. You can use CAD, computer-aided design, computer-aided engineering. In the future, people will sit at a laptop with thousands of others working on a single project to try and make the best of something that could be made at that point in time, best of the best. And that would open the floodgates of innovation. So in other words, far more innovatively efficient.
Yeah, without all this proprietary code, you could have people, things
which would lead
moving
to
along much quicker. And
move to less waste. You'd have universal standardization. If people actually have an interest in sharing the ideas, hence you don't have all the crap, the noise, and the waste that.
What about
planned obsolescence?
Right. What about localization?
Localization, the fourth one. Fourth one or third one?
We're at 4.
We're at 4 already, wow. So localization, I think, will happen naturally due to ephemeralization, a term coined by Buckminster Fuller, which basically means things are always, the process, technology, and design are always going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and more efficient. So, and the computer is just another example of that.
And this decreases a lot of waste. And I mean,
absolutely. And it also incentivizes moving out of globalization, which is simply another form of colonialism. We're exploiting labor and resources in foreign lands that can't defend themselves, or there's such destitution, they have no other option but to adhere to 15 cents an hour and so on.
Right. Just because a country's willing to sell you its resources because it's so desperate doesn't mean that that's good for them.
Free labor.
Yeah.
Free labor. So localization is critically important for the stability of this planet. I mean, again, the average American plate food travels about 1,400 to 1,500 miles for the average American. That's nuts. That's crazy.
Yeah, and we have things like you could buy a $28 table, let's say, wooden table at Walmart. Those trees were cut down in Vancouver, then they were shipped to China to be turned into the pieces, to be put together, then shipped back to Walmart. Yeah. Then Walmart sells it to you the last 4 months, but that's good because you go buy another one.
Yeah. So you see the point. It's obvious that we need to do that, and it will. Again, I think it will be in the market system. Luckily or unluckily, it depends how you look at it. People will gravitate towards localization eventually because it just will be less efficient financially for them to do globalization, especially with the rise of automation.
And then the last one is networked digital feedback.
Okay, that's a big one.
Explain that one.
Well, we have this thing, echoes of old anti-socialist rhetoric. Author Ludwig von Mises years ago wrote that basically you can't have any kind of non-market system because you'd never be able to understand the preferences of the individual, you'd never be able to track supply and demand and all those basic economic parameters and metrics. That is thoroughly ridiculous in the modern day, especially with the internet, with sensor systems. You could have a city that is, well, and this will happen, it's already happening around the world, I'm surprised DC doesn't have it yet, but you'll have a citywide Wi-Fi. And then you connect sensors to all the transactions that are occurring. Boom, you have instant feedback of all the transactions that are happening in the economy. And I'm not necessarily referring to economic, financial transactions. I'm referring to transactions of people just simply getting what they need. As this book progresses, the logic becomes more and more clear that the highest state of efficiency, which would also create the highest level of social amiability, hence the alleviation of all the group versus group woes, is a system that doesn't have money. Now, I don't push that in the sense, I know how irrational that sounds to most people, how foreign that is to most people, they just can't even feel that. But that's something that I talk about and I'll eventually lead to. But I'm very transition oriented. So those 5 things you just mentioned, if we could get anywhere with any of those in a substantial way, you're going to see a dramatic alleviation of social tensions, reduction of poverty, the increase in efficiency, the decrease of waste, more sustainability, and so on. They all have those factors built in as an outcome.
So why don't we hear these ideas and even really just a deeper questioning of capitalism and the free market? It's basically a third rail of politics, but even on most of our media, even people that a lot of the country respects as kind of thinking, forward-thinking people like Elon Musk and let's say Neil deGrasse Tyson and these people that can look at the numbers the same way you can. Why don't you hear it?
It's bias. It's bias. Yeah. There's an overriding bias of people born, especially if they've been rewarded. It doesn't take a degree in social science to see the operant conditioning of the wealthy that reach a point where they've been so rewarded that their brain's like, what? You're not going to counter this system. What are you doing? This is your survival. this is what has been rewarding you. So, and that's why the only thing that any of these guys have talked about is universal basic income. It's the only socially acceptable, plausible thing to do besides charity. And it's a form of charity.
Right.
And they can't justify the lack of it now in the sense of, trying to demean it in some kind of social welfare thing, which, has a terrible connotation to it. Because they see the efficiency. They, meaning the whole of the high business community and government, understands what we're doing with technology, understands the efficiency, understands that all of this efficiency that's been generated over the past 50 years has gone to the 1%, with 8 people with more money now than the bottom of 50%. They know they have to do something if they want to preserve their hierarchy. It's an intuition they feel. So universal basic income is the most logical step for them. But there's plenty more that needs to be done. And I stand with you in the sense of the disgust. Anyone that claims to be for science that hasn't taken the time to just look at their own world, forget about the cosmos for a second. Let's not terraform planets yet. Let's not send rockets. Let's worry about what's happening here for a moment. And I think it's just disappointing. I don't think these concepts are that foreign or that difficult to get people's head around. It's just it's the social indoctrination and the fear of being ostracized and labeled as something that will be inconvenient for their reputations.
Yeah, I think when your bread is buttered from doing one thing, it's tough to change course. But Peter, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
The book is the New Human Rights Movement. It's amazing and excellent, as all your work is. And I'm looking forward to the movie. I guess will come out in a little while.
Into Reflections, hopefully we'll find it's released by the end of the year, but no promises. It just keeps getting pushed back. But yeah, that should be a fun.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, man. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.